My father is a powerful lawyer, forced me into family law. So I ran away, became a judge, and ended up suing and sentencing my own parents for years of emotional abuse. My father is a lawyer. He mistreated me and forced me to study family law. So I ran away and became a judge. I sued them, and as a judge, I sentenced them. I never thought life could be this painful. I don't mean physically, like breaking a bone or suffering from some illness. I'm talking about the kind of pain that digs deep into your soul and festers, growing day by day until it consumes everything. That's the kind of pain I grew up with, and even now, years later, I can't shake it. My parents hated me. I know that sounds extreme, like I'm exaggerating for effect, but I swear to you, it's the truth. It wasn't the kind of hatred that's loud and explosive. It was quiet, simmering just below the surface, but always present. They made sure I felt it in every look, every word, every action. I was a burden to them, something they had to deal with but didn't want, and they never let me forget it. My father, Thomas, was a successful lawyer, the kind of man people in town respected, even feared. He was tall, with a commanding presence, the sort of person who could silence a room just by walking into it. He prided himself on discipline and order, and he expected nothing less from those around him, especially me. To him, I wasn't a son. I was a project, something to mold and shape into his own image. He didn't care what I wanted or who I was. All that mattered was that I become the person he had envisioned, the person he could brag about to his colleagues. And my mother, Judith, well, she was just as cold. She was a beautiful woman, the kind of person people admired from afar. But if you got too close, you'd realize there was nothing underneath. She was empty, hollowed out by years of playing the perfect wife, the perfect hostess, the perfect woman. But there was no warmth in her, no love. Not for me, not for anyone. I was just another obligation to her, something that had ruined whatever dreams she might have had before she married my father. I was an only child, which I think made it worse. There was no one to share the burden with, no sibling to take some of the pressure off. It was just me, alone, trapped in a house that felt more like a prison than a home. My earliest memories are of the silence, the suffocating silence that filled every room, every hallway, every moment of my life. I learned early on that it was better to be invisible. The less they noticed me, the safer I was. School wasn't much better. I thought it would be my escape, but it turned out to be just another battlefield. My father made it clear from the moment I started kindergarten that anything less than perfection was unacceptable. I wasn't there to make friends or have fun. I was there to learn, to excel, to be the best. He didn't care about my happiness. In fact, I don't think he even believed in happiness. It was just a distraction, a weakness, something that got in the way of success. So, I buried myself in my studies. I worked harder than anyone else, not because I wanted to, but because I was terrified of what would happen if I didn't. Every report card, every test, every assignment was a matter of life and death for me. If I came home with anything less than an A, the disappointment in my father's eyes would crush me. He never had to raise his voice or his hand. His silence, his cold stares were punishment enough. But even when I succeeded, it was never enough. No matter how hard I worked, no matter how many accolades I brought home, my father always found something to criticize. You could have done better, he'd say, flipping through my report card with a frown. Why wasn't this a perfect score? What happened here? He'd point to a single mistake, a single blemish on an otherwise flawless record, and that would be all he'd focus on. My mother, on the other hand, barely paid attention at all. She floated through life in a haze, consumed by her own unhappiness. If she noticed my achievements, she never said anything. The most I ever got from her was a perfunctory, "That's nice," before she went back to whatever it was she did all day. I'm not even sure what that was, to be honest. I think she spent most of her time in the garden, or reading magazines, trying to pretend that her life wasn't as empty as it was. I tried to be the perfect son. I really did. I followed all the rules, stayed out of trouble, did everything they asked of me. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't make them love me. I couldn't even make them like me. And after a while, I stopped trying. I withdrew into myself, building walls around my heart to protect what little was left of it. By the time I reached high school, I was a master at hiding my feelings. I had to be. If I let any vulnerability show, my father would pounce on it, using it as proof that I wasn't strong enough, wasn't good enough. So I kept my head down and focused on my studies. I didn't have time for friends or dating, or any of the normal things teenagers did. My life was a constant cycle of school, home, study, repeat. And it wasn't just my father's expectations that weighed on me. My mother had her own subtle ways of making me feel like I was never enough. She was always comparing me to other kids, pointing out how so-and-so's son got into this Ivy League school, or how someone else's daughter was already working at a prestigious firm. It didn't matter that I was doing well in school, that I had a near-perfect GPA, that I was taking AP classes and involved in extracurriculars. To her, I was just another disappointment. I started having panic attacks around my junior year. It would come out of nowhere, these sudden waves of fear and dread that left me gasping for breath, my heart racing in my chest. I'd lock myself in the bathroom, gripping the edge of the sink, trying to calm myself down. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't stop the panic from taking over. I was terrified all the time. Terrified of failing, terrified of letting my parents down, terrified of being worthless. I didn't tell anyone about the panic attacks. What would be the point? My father would have seen it as a sign of weakness, another failure to add to the list. My mother wouldn't have cared. So I suffered in silence, pushing myself harder and harder, hoping that one day it would be enough. But it never was. When it came time to apply for college, my father already had a plan for me. I was going to study law just like he had. It didn't matter that I had no interest in it, that the thought of spending my life in courtrooms and offices made me want to scream. My future had been decided for me long before I was even old enough to understand what that meant. I got into a prestigious university, of course. My grades were perfect, my extracurriculars impressive, and my father had enough connections to make sure I was accepted. But the moment I stepped foot on campus, I felt a crushing sense of dread. This wasn't my life. This wasn't what I wanted. But I didn't know how to break free. I didn't know how to say no. So I went through the motions. I attended classes, studied for exams, and did everything I was supposed to do. But I was dying. The pressure, the fear, the anxiety. It was all too much. I started drinking just a little at first to take the edge off. But soon it became a nightly ritual. I needed it to numb the pain, to quiet the voices in my head telling me I wasn't good enough. The panic attacks got worse. There were nights when I thought I was going to die. When the weight of it all felt like was crushing me, I would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, my heart pounding in my chest, wondering if it would ever stop. But it never did. And then, one day, I snapped. I couldn't take it anymore. I couldn't live this life, this lie, any longer. I packed a bag, withdrew what little money I had from the bank, and disappeared. I didn't leave a note. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I just left. I took the first bus out of town, heading for a city I'd never been to before. I didn't care where I went, as long as it was far away from them. From the life they had forced on me. From the expectations that were killing me. For the first time in my life, I felt free. But freedom, I quickly learned, wasn't what I thought it would be. I had no plan, no direction, no idea how to survive on my own. I found a cheap apartment in a rundown part of the city and started looking for work. It wasn't easy. My degree was useless without a law license, and I had no other skills. So I took whatever jobs I could find. Bartending, working in a coffee shop, cleaning offices. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. The first few months were the hardest. I was constantly looking over my shoulder, half expecting my father to show up and drag me back home. But he never did. They never did. I hadn't spoken to my parents since the day I left, and I had no intention of ever speaking to them again. They didn't want me in their lives, and I didn't want them in mine. But even though I was physically free from them, the scars they had left behind remained. The fear, the anxiety, the self-doubt, It was all still there, lurking in the back of my mind. I'd spent my entire life trying to live up to their expectations, and now that those expectations were gone, I didn't know who I was anymore. I tried to find myself to figure out who I was without them. But it wasn't easy. I had spent so many years being molded into someone. I wasn't that I had no idea who I really was. I drifted from job to job, city to city, hoping that one day something would click, that I would find some sense of purpose or meaning in my life. But it never came. The loneliness was the worst part. I had no friends, no family, no one to talk to. I spent most of my time alone in my apartment, too scared to reach out to anyone, too scared to trust anyone. I had been taught my whole life that vulnerability was weakness, that emotions were something to be controlled, suppressed. So I kept everything bottled up inside, letting it fester until it poisoned everything. I started drinking more, not just to take the edge off, but to forget. To forget the pain, the fear, the emptiness. I would sit alone in my apartment, nursing a bottle of cheap whiskey, trying to drown out the voices in my head. But no matter how much I drank, they were always there, whispering in the dark, telling me I wasn't good enough, that I never would be. It's been years since I left, and I'm still lost. I've moved cities a few times, trying to outrun the feeling of being trapped, but it always catches up to me. No matter where I go, the fear and despair follow me. I've tried therapy, but it hasn't helped. I've tried reaching out to people, but I always end up pushing them away. It's like there's this wall around me that I can't break through, no matter how hard I try. I thought running away would solve everything. I thought that once I was free from my parents, I could finally start living. But the truth is, I don't know how to live. I don't know who I am without their expectations guiding me. And that's the scariest part of all. I'm still waiting for that moment of clarity, that epiphany where everything clicks into place, and I finally figure out who I am and what I want. But I'm starting to think that moment might never come. Maybe this is all there is. Fear, despair, and a life half-lived. When I walked into that courthouse for the first time, I had no idea what I was looking for. I didn't know what kind of peace or resolution I could possibly find in a place I had spent my entire life trying to avoid. But there I was, standing in the back of a courtroom, watching a trial unfold. The defendant, a man in his mid-40s, sat stoic, his expression blank, as his wife tearfully recounted years of physical and emotional abuse. It was like seeing my own life unfold in front of me, but magnified, intensified. Every word that left her mouth, every example of manipulation and cruelty, felt like it was being ripped from my own memories. The walls of that courtroom felt like they were closing in on me as I listened to her testimony. And when the judge handed down the verdict, sentencing that bastard 2 years behind bars, something clicked inside me. It was a feeling I hadn't expected, a sense of purpose. For the first time in my life, I wasn't running from something. I wasn't a passive victim of circumstances beyond my control. I was watching justice unfold, real justice, and I wanted to be part of that. I wanted to be the person who handed down those sentences, who ensured that the people who hurt others were held accountable for their actions. That day changed everything for me. I enrolled in law school not long after that. It felt surreal at first. I had spent my entire life running from anything that reminded me of my father, of the oppressive expectations he had forced on me. And yet here I was, willingly diving headfirst into the world of law. But this time, it wasn't for him. It was for me. The next few years were some of the hardest of my life. I was older than most of the students in my class by nearly a decade. While they were fresh out of college, bright-eyed, and eager to take on the world, I was battle-hardened, worn down by years of surviving on the margins. I didn't have the same energy, the same optimism they did. But what I did have was determination. I had seen the darkness that lurked in the world, and I was driven by a need to confront it head-on. I threw myself into my studies with a single-minded focus that surprised even me. I worked harder than I ever had before, pulling all-nighters in the library, reading through case after case, and absorbing every piece of legal knowledge I could. But it wasn't just about passing exams or earning a degree. It was about arming myself with the tools I needed to make a real difference. I knew what kind of people I wanted to face in court: the abusers, the manipulators, the predators who preyed on the vulnerable. and I knew that I needed to be prepared. After 3 years, I graduated and passed the bar. But instead of practicing law like my father had always wanted, I pursued a different path. I applied for a position as a prosecutor, determined to be on the side of those who had been wronged. My first case was a small one, a petty theft trial that barely took a day to resolve, but it felt like a victory nonetheless. I was in the courtroom, standing up for what was right, and that was enough. Over time, the cases grew more complex, more high-profile. I took on domestic violence cases, child abuse cases, and fraud cases. Each one was a reminder of why I had chosen this path. I wasn't just prosecuting criminals. I was standing up for the people who couldn't stand up for themselves. I was giving a voice to the voiceless, the same way I had once needed someone to speak for me. One case that stuck with me was a particularly brutal one involving a man named Daniel O'Connor, a respected member of the community, a church leader no less, who had been secretly abusing his wife and 2 daughters for years. From the outside, Daniel appeared to be the perfect family man. He was charming, well-spoken, and active in the community. No one could have guessed what was happening behind closed doors. But eventually, the truth came out. His wife, battered and broken, had finally found the courage to come forward, and she brought with her stories that would make anyone's blood run cold. The trial lasted for weeks. Every day, I had to sit there and listen to the details of the abuse, details that mirrored so many of my own experiences. The control, the manipulation, the emotional and psychological warfare. Daniel was a master at it. His daughters, now teenagers, testified about how he had turned them against their mother, how he had isolated them from their friends and family, how he had made them believe that they were worthless without him. It was heartbreaking. But the worst part, Daniel never showed any remorse. Not once did he express regret for what he had done. He sat there, smug and defiant, as if he truly believed that he had done nothing wrong. His defense attorney, an arrogant man named Lucas Bryant, tried to paint Daniel as a misunderstood father who had been pushed to his breaking point by an ungrateful wife. It was sickening. When it came time for sentencing, I didn't hold back. I recommended the maximum sentence, 30 years in prison, without the possibility of parole. I wanted to make sure that Daniel would never be able to hurt anyone again. And when the judge agreed, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. I'd made a difference. I had brought justice to a family that had been living in fear for far too long. It was cases like that that kept me going. They reminded me of why I had chosen this path, why I had worked so hard to get here. I wasn't just convicting criminals. I was making sure that people like Daniel O'Connor, people who used their power and privilege to hurt others, were held accountable. But as satisfying as those victories were, they came at a cost. The emotional toll of hearing those stories day after day, of seeing the pain and suffering that people endured, started to wear on me. I tried to keep it all at arm's length, to stay professional and detached. But it wasn't always possible. There were nights when I couldn't sleep, when the faces of the victims haunted me. I would wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, unable to shake the feeling that I wasn't doing enough. That's when I met Sarah. She was a defense attorney, which meant we were often on opposite sides of the courtroom. But despite our professional rivalry, we formed an unlikely friendship. Sarah was tough as nails in the courtroom, but outside of it, she was one of the most compassionate people I had ever met. She had grown up in foster care, bouncing from one abusive home to another, and she had made it her mission to defend those who couldn't defend themselves. We started meeting up after tough cases, grabbing drinks at a local bar and venting about the system. At first, it was just about work, complaining about the bureaucracy, the endless paperwork, the judges who seemed more interested in keeping the status quo than delivering real justice. But over time, our conversations became more personal. We shared stories about our pasts, about the things that had shaped us into the people we were today. Sarah was one of the few people who really understood what it was like to carry the weight of other people's pain. She had seen it all, the worst of humanity, the brokenness that existed just beneath the surface of society. And yet, she hadn't let it break her. If anything, it had made her stronger. One night, after a particularly brutal trial involving a young girl who had been trafficked, Sarah and I sat in a booth at the bar, nursing our drinks in silence. Neither of us said anything for a long time. There was nothing to say. The girl's story had been horrifying. sold by her own father to pay off a gambling debt, forced into a life of unspeakable abuse. It was the kind of case that made you question everything, made you wonder how the world could be so cruel. Eventually, Sarah broke the silence. "You ever wonder if we're doing enough?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Like, we get these convictions, we put these people away, but it doesn't change what happened. It doesn't fix anything." I didn't have an answer for her. I had asked myself that same question 1,000 times. We were doing everything we could, but it never felt like enough. The system was flawed, broken in so many ways, and no matter how hard we worked, there would always be another victim, another monster lurking in the shadows. But that's the thing about justice, it's not about fixing the past. It's about making sure that the people who did the damage can't do it again. It's about holding them accountable, even if it's only a small piece of the puzzle. As time went on, I found myself leaning more and more on Sarah. She became my anchor, the person who kept me grounded when the weight of the world threatened to pull me under. And in return, I tried to be the same for her. We were just colleagues anymore, we were friends. And in a job like ours, that meant everything. But Sarah wasn't the only person who helped me through the darkness. There was also Mark, a fellow judge who had been in the game for decades. He was gruff, no nonsense, the kind of man who didn't waste time with pleasantries. But beneath that tough exterior, he had a heart of gold. Mark had been a cop before he became a judge, and he had seen things that would have broken most people. He had lost partners, friends, people he had sworn to protect, and yet he had never let it harden him. He had never let the darkness consume him. Instead, he used it as fuel, as motivation to keep fighting for what was right. Mark became something of a mentor to me. He taught me how to navigate the complexities of the legal system without losing my soul in the process. He showed me how to stay grounded, how to find balance in a job that often felt like it was designed to break you. One of the most important lessons he taught me was that you couldn't save everyone. It was a harsh reality, but it was the truth. No matter how hard you tried, no matter how much you wanted to, there would always be people who slipped through the cracks. And if you let that consume you, if you let it eat away at you, you wouldn't be able to save anyone. "Focus on the ones you can help," he told me one night after court. You can't fix the whole system, but you can make a difference, one case at a time. And that's what I did. I focused on the cases in front of me, the people who needed justice in that moment. And slowly but surely, I started to find peace in that. I wasn't going to change the world overnight, but I was making a difference. And that was enough. As the years went on, I took on more and more high-profile cases. One that stands out in my memory involved a wealthy businessman named Richard Caldwell. On the surface, Richard seemed like a model citizen. He donated to charities, attended galas, and was known for his philanthropy. But behind closed doors, he was running a massive Ponzi scheme, defrauding hundreds of people out of their life savings. The trial lasted for months, and the media coverage was relentless. Every day, there were new revelations about the extent of Richard's crimes, about the lives he had ruined. Elderly couples who had lost everything, single mothers who had been left destitute, families torn apart by financial ruin. It was one of the most difficult cases I had ever worked on, not because of the legal complexities, but because of the emotional toll. In the end, Richard was convicted, and I sentenced him to 50 years in prison. But as satisfying as that victory was, it didn't erase the damage he had done. It didn't bring back the homes that had been lost, the lives that had been destroyed, and that was something I had to live with. But through it all, I had my friends, Sarah, Mark, and the others I had met along the way. We were a team, bound together by our shared experiences, our shared pain, and our shared determination to fight for justice. We supported each other, celebrated our victories, and helped each other through the defeats. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel alone. I had found my calling, I had found my people, and I had found a way to turn the pain of my past into something meaningful. I had spent years working within the system, delivering justice to others, giving voice to the voiceless, and holding those accountable who thought they were untouchable. But for all the victories I had achieved, all the criminals I had put behind bars, there was still one trial that had been looming in the back of my mind. The one case I had been avoiding all these years, The one case that was most personal, my parents. For years I had buried the trauma of my childhood deep within me, using it as fuel to drive my passion for justice. But no matter how much I tried to pretend that I had moved on, that I was stronger now, the truth was that the pain still lingered. The ghosts of my parents' abuse still haunted me, and no matter how many cases I presided over, no matter how many convictions I handed down, I couldn't escape the fact that I had never truly faced them. Not head on. The idea of suing my own parents for the emotional and psychological abuse they had inflicted on me as a child had crossed my mind more than once. But it always seemed too complicated, too personal. And as much as I hated to admit it, there was still a part of me that feared them. Especially my father. He had spent his entire life manipulating people, using the law as his weapon, and I knew that going up against him in court wouldn't be easy. But then something happened that changed everything. It started with a phone call. Sarah, my closest friend and confidant, called me late one evening, her voice tight with emotion. Sarah never got emotional, at least not like this, so I knew something was wrong. "I need to talk to you," she said. Her words clipped, urgent. "It's about something that happened a long time ago. Something I've never told anyone." We met up at the usual bar, the same place we had spent countless nights after tough cases, decompressing and sharing our frustrations with the system. But tonight, there was no venting, no easy banter. Sarah sat across from me, her hands wrapped around her drink, staring into the amber liquid like it held the answers she had been searching for. "Remember when I told you about my time in foster care?" she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "How I moved around a lot. Never really found a home." I nodded, unsure of where this was going. Sarah had mentioned her rough childhood before, but she had never gone into detail. It was something we both understood on a fundamental level. The pain of growing up in a broken home, the scars it left behind. "There's something I never told you," she continued, her eyes still fixed on her drink. "One of the foster homes I lived in, it wasn't just neglectful, it was abusive, really abusive." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had suspected as much, given how guarded Sarah was about her past, but hearing her say it out loud was different. It made it real. She looked up at me then, her eyes filled with a mixture of shame and anger. "They used to hit me, not just the parents, but the other kids too. It was hell. I never told anyone because I didn't think anyone would believe me. And even if they did, what could they do? It was so long ago." "Sarah," I said, my voice firm but gentle, "you know you can still take legal action, right? There's no statute of limitations on child abuse in the state. You could sue them, hold them accountable for what they did to you." She shook her head, a bitter smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "I thought about it, I really did. But the thing is, I don't know if I can go through with it. I've spent my whole life trying to move past it, trying to forget. I don't want to dredge it all up again." I understood where she was coming from. Facing the people who had hurt you, especially after so many years, wasn't easy. But I also knew that sometimes, the only way to truly heal was to confront the past head-on. And I wasn't about to let Sarah carry this burden alone. "You don't have to do it alone," I told her. "I'll help you. We'll take them to court. I'll represent you. And we'll make sure they pay for what they did." For a moment, Sarah didn't say anything. She just stared at me, her eyes searching mine, as if trying to decide whether or not she could trust me with this. Then, finally, she nodded. "Okay," she whispered. "Let's do it." That's when everything changed. The plan to sue my parents didn't start out as a calculated move for revenge. It began as a way to help Sarah, to give her the justice she deserved after all these years. But as we began preparing the case, I started to realize something. This wasn't just about Sarah. It was about me too. As we dug into the legal proceedings, I realized just how similar our experiences had been. Sarah had suffered physical abuse, while my own was more emotional, more insidious. But the underlying dynamics were the same. Power, control, manipulation. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I had spent my entire life running from the very thing I needed to confront. So I made a decision. I wasn't just going to help Sarah sue her abusers. I was going to sue my own parents too, for everything they had done to me. For the years of torment, the emotional scars, the psychological manipulation. It was time to stop running. The case was complicated, to say the least. My father, being a well-respected lawyer, had connections all over the legal world. He had a reputation to protect, and I knew he wouldn't go down without a fight. But I didn't care. I was ready for this. I had spent years preparing for this moment, even if I hadn't realized it at the time. Sarah and I hired a team of the best attorneys we could find. People we trusted. People who had no problem going up against powerful figures. They were relentless in their pursuit of justice, digging up every piece of evidence they could find, interviewing witnesses, and building a case that would hold up in court. The first time my parents found out about the lawsuit was through the official court summons. I'll never forget the look on my father's face when he saw my name listed as the plaintiff. He was furious, of course. But more than that, he was shocked. He had always thought of himself as untouchable, as someone who could control everything and everyone around him. And now, his own son was coming after him. My mother, on the other hand, looked devastated. I could see the fear in her eyes, the realization that the life she had built was about to come crashing down. She had always been more fragile than my father, more easily broken. And I knew that this lawsuit would destroy her in ways she couldn't even comprehend. But I didn't care. Not anymore. The trial itself was long and grueling. My father hired a team of high-powered attorneys to defend him, pulling every string he could to delay the proceedings, to discredit me and Sarah, to paint us as disgruntled, unstable individuals looking for revenge. But we were ready for him. The courtroom was packed every day, with reporters and spectators eager to see the scandal unfold. After all, it wasn't every day that a prominent lawyer was sued by his own son for child abuse. The media ate it up, turning it into a sensational story that dominated the headlines for weeks. But I wasn't interested in the spectacle. I was focused on the case, on the evidence, on proving once and for all that my parents had abused me, emotionally, psychologically, and that they deserved to be held accountable. Sarah's testimony was the hardest to sit through. I had known about her abuse, of course, but hearing the details laid out in such stark, brutal terms was heartbreaking. She recounted the beatings, the nights spent hiding in her room, the constant fear that hung over her like a cloud. And through it all, she remained composed, strong, determined to see this through to the end. When it was my turn to take the stand, I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. I had spent my entire life trying to forget what my parents had done to me, trying to convince myself that it wasn't as bad as it had been. But now I had no choice but to face it head-on. I told the court everything. About the emotional manipulation, the constant pressure to be perfect, the fear of failure that had haunted me for years. I spoke about the panic attacks, the nights spent crying in my room, the way my parents had made me feel like I was worthless, like I would never be good enough for them. And as I spoke, I could feel the weight lifting off my shoulders. For the first time, I was reclaiming my story, taking control of my own narrative. I wasn't a victim anymore. I was fighting back. My father's defense was as cold and calculated as I had expected. He denied everything, of course, claiming that he had only ever acted in my best interests, that he had pushed me to succeed because he wanted the best for me. His attorneys tried to paint him as a loving father who had been misunderstood, who had only ever wanted to see his son thrive. But I wasn't buying it. And neither was the jury. The trial dragged on for weeks, with both sides presenting their arguments, their evidence, their witnesses. It was exhausting, physically, emotionally, mentally. But I refused to back down. I'd come too far to give up now. One of the most shocking moments of the trial came when my father's former colleagues took the stand. Several of them testified about his behavior over the years, how he had bullied and manipulated people in the legal world, using his power to get what he wanted. It was a sign of him that the public had never seen before, and it shattered the image of the upstanding lawyer he had cultivated for so long. My mother, meanwhile, barely said a word throughout the entire trial. She sat there, pale and trembling, as if the weight of it all was too much for her to bear. And maybe it was. I had no sympathy for her. She had stood by and allowed the abuse to happen. She had been complicit in my father's cruelty, and for that she was just as guilty. The turning point came when Sarah and I presented a piece of evidence that even my father's high-powered attorneys couldn't refute. It was an old journal of mine, one I had kept hidden for years, detailing the emotional abuse I had suffered at the hands of my parents. Page after page, I had written about the things they had said to me, the way they had made me feel like I was nothing. It was raw, painful, and undeniable. In the end, the jury found in our favor. My parents were held liable for the emotional and psychological abuse they had inflicted on me, and they were ordered to pay a substantial settlement. It wasn't about the money, though. It was about justice. It was about finally standing up to them, finally breaking free from the hold they had over me. After the trial, I didn't speak to my parents again. I didn't need to. The case had been settled, and I had won. But more importantly, I had taken back control of my life. I had confronted the demons of my past and come out stronger on the other side.